Good morning. Hello, my name is Kathryn Hilton from Contoural. Welcome to today's webinar on creating a records management program, information project plans that avoid getting stuck. We have good information to present today. We have two speakers, myself and Steve Bradley. And both Steve and I have been at Contoural for the past 6 to 8 years and have 20+ years experience in creating and implementing these types of programs. So why don't we go ahead and get started. Steve, why don't you kick it off and talk a little bit about what doesn't work in terms of faulty approaches that we see in and why companies often get stuck in developing these kinds of programs. Bhargav, can you put it forward a couple slides, please?
Okay. Yeah, and here's some of the common things we see when folks start to implement these. You know, some of them we have catchphrases for, like a cookie cutter approach, trying essentially to take approaches others have done and just apply them. Some it's like, you know, focused on one thing, deleting data, trying to find, you know, cost savings, slash and burn, sometimes we refer to that. Boil the ocean, biting off more than you can chew, or, you know, trying to move forward without executive buy-in. And so there's a number of these approaches that are challenging. Some, again, you know, many folks refer to these as a Chicken Little approach, where you're trying to scare folks into submission. And that can work. And the challenge with all of these is, without taking a comprehensive view to your program, to building a program from the ground up, getting proper support, building that foundation, and itemizing out projects then that can be sustainable, then you run the risk of sort of wearing out your welcome with folks and, you know, basically losing the platform and whatever influence you've gained. So a lot of what we'll be talking about today then are from our experiences of how clients we've seen, how they may have had a good start to a project, but then they get somewhere down the path and either run out of resources, get stuck, meet key barriers. You know, what are ways that you can avoid those sorts of things? And so we'll be talking a little bit more about that as we go along.
Next slide.
Next slide. There you go.
So how many of you have come to this situation where you're interested in implementing an ECM solution, you get the ECM project put on the technology roadmap, IT will reach out, or the records management program will reach out to legal for what should be the specific policy settings in that particular ECM or document management solution. And then they say, we should form a committee and discuss this and really understand it. And then the committee meets, and the committee meets, and the committee meets, and the project ends up stalling out because there is no consensus, there's no momentum to actually get the project moving forward. We've seen this repeatedly again and again. And so, again, we want to talk today about how to avoid this, how to set up the projects right from the beginning, because that's really where we see things often fail is we get into a program and it hasn't really started out with the initial foundation and a project plan to get the project moving forward correctly. The other thing that we want to talk about today is also how you can get all the constituents in the same room and discuss some of the key issues. So next slide.
This is the proverbial elephant in the room. Often we see with information governance, records information management programs, it's like a hot potato within an organization. Yes, a lot of folks want to see the benefits of that type of program, but the real key is who is going to own this, who's going to pay for it. And so it's one thing to say, I want to see the benefits, I'd like to see, you know, these sorts of things be implemented, but actually taking ownership and responsibility is key. And that's one of the things that we see, one of the key reasons why projects stall out or get stuck, is that there's a lot of stakeholders who want to see progress, but maybe they're not willing to stick their neck out and actually count the costs and take ownership of it. It can be a daunting task, but really without addressing that question, without being willing to go there, to ask the tough questions and say, you know, why in fact are we not taking this on? Maybe your organization has a history of failed projects in the past. the ECM program or the ECM project where you rolled out a system and did a bunch of scanning and imaging and you just created an electronic dumping ground. You know, there may be some past perils and pain points within your organization that are unique that cause people not to want to step up and take ownership and responsibility. But that's a real key up front. If you're going to have success with this type of program, you need to be able to ask tough questions and identify cleanly up front who is responsible, who's willing to support it. If you're not able to count that type of cost and build a business case up front, then you don't have the proper foundation to move forward.
So get the issues up front, make sure that you've got the buy-in, and get the issues out and discussed and be able to move forward. Next slide. Sorry, it seems like we're having a lag. Argov, next slide. I seem not to be seeing the slide, but I'll go ahead and start discussing. What we should be seeing is a slide that is called what are the real program drivers? Often what we find is that records management starts out with an initiative around developing a policy and a schedule, but then implementation takes a lot longer and often can stall out. What we want to make sure is that the implementation takes a bigger picture view. What is it really going to take to get that policy and schedule implemented? And what that means is often you're going to have to work with lots of other organizations and constituents and stakeholders within the organization. So obviously we're going to have to talk with legal and compliance, but often business continuity gets involved because you might be able to leverage their resources in terms of establishing a matrix organization to support the activities. You might want to get involved in terms of privacy requirements because as you're talking about deleting and managing and applying governance to data, privacy has become a bigger and bigger driver for these programs and what will happen in terms of what happens to the data if there's a breach, et cetera. IT obviously wants always to control costs, and so they're interested in how can I delete data, how can I meet my backup windows, how can I reduce my storage costs. So making sure that you understand each of these different stakeholders has different benefits that they're expecting out of the program will help you build that foundation and make sure that you can have a larger group that's pushing for the program because it's providing multiple benefits down the road. The tendency that we tend to see is that it's viewed as my project. It has a narrow focus, and by broadening it to a cross-functional team, you have a much larger success in building and executing the project. However, what we're not saying is that taking this big picture approach means building a boil the ocean or a huge initiative. What we want to say is take a big picture approach, understand these stakeholder drivers, but also be able to break it down into manageable pieces and not really try to create this enormous initiative going forward. Next slide. So what we look at is 5 key elements of a successful plan. We want to make sure that we can drive and support the plan, identify the key projects in the timeline. So what do I need to do? When do I need to do it? Again, set really realistic goals and metrics. So in year 1, we want to complete a policy and schedule. Year 2, we want to look at what equipment needs to be bought, et cetera. So we're going to be showing you some different project plans on how you can roll these initiatives out in a doable process. Often we see things fail because of change management. What we're asking employees to do is a change in behavior, essentially, and so we want to make sure that for each step of the project, we've got the right change management built in, and this is behavior change management as well as change management if technology is employed. And finally, on the back end, how do we measure the success of what we've done, and how do we monitor it then for compliance ultimately? Next slide. Steve, why don't you take over and talk a little bit about the business drivers?
Okay, sure. So starting with this first step, driving and supporting the plan, a real key here is to sell your plan to your business. You need to understand the business's needs. And you may have had the experience where you've had kids who are doing door-to-door sales, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, selling things for their school, things of that nature. And it's funny because often their sales pitch is oriented around what's in it for them. If you buy X number of boxes of cookies, then I get to go to camp, I get to go on a trip, et cetera. And so I always try to point out to those kids, while buying something from them to help them out, but to say, you know what, the real point in sales is not how it benefits you. It's how it benefits those you're trying to convince. And so a secret just between those of us on this call is that, for those of us who traffic in information governance, records management, we may be excited and geek out on the latest data privacy laws or the discipline of library science in and of itself, but it's likely that others in your organization probably don't share your enthusiasm. And so the key then is understanding and identifying what the pains, the problems, the challenges folks in your business are facing. How will your program make their lives better? And so as opposed to coming at folks and trying to help them see things from your point of view, if you can start and understand things from their point of view, and then see how can my program approach around information governance and around records management, how can it actually benefit the business? How can it address some key concerns, some risks? A lot of businesses do have key challenges around regulatory compliance. If you have a large outlay in terms of dollars for certain litigation or cases, if there's a real risk, or in fact you've experienced pain around data loss or privacy breaches, then this may be a sore subject, and it may be in fact an area that you can speak to in terms of the benefits of your program and how that applies to your business. But oftentimes folks will just focus on the negative, and that's sort of the chicken little thing. The sky is falling. If we don't do this, things will go poorly. Often the real key is to focus on the positive benefits. How can an information governance program, records management, records retention, how can that improve productivity? How can it simplify complex and redundant record-keeping practices? How can you streamline people's business processes? How can you help people reclaim lost time, make things more efficient? And also look for cost savings. How can people do things more efficiently? How can you eliminate waste, duplication of effort? When you start understanding those things and applying your programmatic efforts on that front, you'll have much more success in being able to understand the key drivers and then start to build a foundation of business case for your project going forward. Okay, next slide. All right, another key as well, and we say start with the business because the key to gaining executive support is really having your finger on the pulse of your unique organization. And so when we talk about cookie cutter and copycat approaches, often where those fail is they fail to look at the unique conditions that exist in your business and your organization. So we usually start out with folks and speak of doing an assessment to the extent you can up front. Engage the business, engage folks, gather facts. Executives want information. Opinions are one thing, but being able to actually come at them with facts, real information, and you can show real benefit and real values is what they're looking for. So defining program benefits around areas like risk reduction, compliance, cost reduction, and then more positive areas like increasing the value of your data and improving productivity. Those are messages that speak to the heart, and pluck the heartstrings of your executives. Often we find, too, that looking at things from a maturity model approach is very successful because that gives you a way to benchmark where you are in the beginning. And there's a number of models that are out there that are useful. But again, the caution is not to just take a model from the outside and just apply it and think that's good enough. In many respects, it can have a detrimental effect Because if people see that you're bringing in something that's sort of foreign and outside and doesn't really speak to the needs or isn't a good fit for your organization, they may reject it, kind of like an organ donor that rejects a organ from the outside. It doesn't quite fit. It's rejected by the body. And so that's what you don't want to have happen. So the key is basically customizing your approach, understanding and doing this type of assessment so you can have your finger on the pulse of the real needs of your business, the unique conditions on the ground. Then you can start to speak the executive's language in terms of their priorities and requirements. And so speaking of benchmarking, we will move on to the next slide, and I'll pass it back to Kathryn.
Thanks, Steve. So in terms of other types of benchmarks that we find really successful in communicating the value of the program and why you need to do it, are looking at things in relationships to your various industries and specifically your peers. So while the example Steve just showed was a benchmark against general best practices, the next level down that should be looked at is specifically what is in your industry. And so this is a live example. We're also trying to make sure that people are seeing in this webinar, these are extracts and anonymized from real data that we're collecting from our clients. So these are good examples for you to look at, but obviously need to be customized for your particular industry or segment of the market. But this is for the consumer packaged good industry. We looked at benchmarks for how mature they were in electronic information. That means how well they were dealing with their email, for instance, how they were dealing with their unstructured data, how they were doing lifecycle management or ECM solution management. And then we looked at their litigation profile. So, what you would think is that someone that had very high litigation would have very mature practices around their information governance, but that's not always the case. And so it's interesting to see that some companies are willing to take a pretty high risk approach, but when you look at then using that to support moving to that upper right quadrant, it's a really good motivator. So if you were the number 14 company, for instance, and you saw that one of your biggest competitors, number 3, was much more mature in terms of their practices, it can be implied then that they probably have potentially lower costs for litigation, discovery, and other risk categories. So it's important to see these might not be the right metrics for your company, but in this particular instance, it's again, a different lens to look at how you're doing against your particular industry. Next slide. Another slice through it is looking at your peers specifically in a different way. We looked at a further refinement down from all electronic information to specifically email management. Email is often one of the first projects that is undertaken in a governance process and program because it is usually fairly self-contained. It's a lot of pain for both the users. It's pain for the attorneys. It's pain for IT. And so there are a lot of wins that can come out of getting email under control. But they are typically projects that also impact every single employee, so they're not taken on lightly. And how can you get your company to focus on being more mature around email management? So we looked at a number of different companies in another industry survey that we were doing in terms of where did that company stack up in terms of its peers. And as you can see, these are large, fairly large Fortune 500 and mid-tier companies. How mature were they in managing their email? And some companies were extremely mature. They had an email archive. They were using retention settings. They had done sophisticated training of all their employees, et cetera. And so there were different criteria that met this ranking, but you can see if you were this company XYZ and comparing to your peers, you would see that you were fairly far behind in what their maturity is. And this directly resulted in this company being able to put together a program for email. Next slide, Steve. Actually, I'm going to continue in terms of building on that. So once you have a program, put in place, we also need to look at who's going to lead the program and what is the ask in terms of resources from the executive, as well as who else will be needed on the team to move the program forward. Some companies have a sophisticated records management organization already put in place. Many do not. And so we're providing this as an overview so we can discuss what's typical. So to get a program off the ground, we're looking at this cross-functional steering committee. So we're looking at people that have the seniority to drive the program down and out through the organization. We're looking at key stakeholders in terms of the program executive, whether that be IT, legal, RIM, or some combination. And then branching out within the organization. Do we have leads established from compliance or business continuity that we can utilize throughout the organization? And then driving it down finally to the feet on the ground that are actually going to be helping out with the implementation projects, the record coordinators, or coordinator leads, however the terminology varies between organizations. And how do you put this matrix or organizational structure together to drive programs out? Really depends on your particular culture, what your regional and geographic requirements are, how siloed your business units are, but take into consideration that you're not going to be able to do it as a single individual to drive these kinds of programs. It really does take a team approach and having that top-down support. Next slide.
Okay, and then now, as we transition from this first step, which is establishing that foundation, driving and gaining support for your program, now we move into this second step, which is identifying projects and timelines. And this step's really all about developing a plan. And so, as then General Eisenhower once said, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And those are wise words, for if you're about to set off on a long journey, you need to count the cost, to consider what resources you're going to need and how you're going to get them. So just like in construction, the key to building a strong program is the foundation. Without a strong foundation or a strong root system, future growth and stability isn't possible. So this hit home to me just last year. We had in our backyard what we thought was a really healthy maple tree. It was taller than our house, provided shade during the hot summer, turned beautiful colors in the fall. Overall, a great tree. Until a storm came. And we discovered the root system had bunched up against a landscaped retaining wall, causing it not to be able to support its own weight. And so strong winds came. Fortunately, it fell away from our house and not on top of our house, but it still was a colossal mess. It involved me getting out and cutting many pieces and carving them off. So the purpose of that story is to illustrate the first step in planning anything is to establish the support system. If you're in it for the long haul, if you're trying to establish a type of foundation, you really do need to count the cost. So from there, you start out building the foundation and by identifying your organization's needs, as we've spoken of before. And then what will it take to address them? How can we actually solve some of these problems? The real power, though, in doing the assessment, discussing, and having conversations with people up front is that often they can tell you, when you give them an opportunity to step off out of their day-to-day routine and actually ask people questions and say, if you had the resources, how would you solve these problems? Often these projects will bubble up out of those types of conversations. So the key is to start to identify those and say, okay, to get us from where we are today to where we would like to be in a future state, what do we need to do? Let's start identifying all those. The key, though, is not to become overwhelmed and to start to break those things into manageable chunks. And as you do that, it's the old adage of how do you eat an elephant? You do it a bite at a time. And so when you start organizing these things in bite-sized chunks, then you can start to prioritize and say, what are the things that we need to do first? What are the elements that we need to address that may be foundational that essentially helps you to build on for further projects, because some of the tasks are dependent on some other things being in position for them to be there. So that's the key, is to look at, beginning to look at priorities, and then also considering your own internal budgetary constraints, approval cycles, start to build cost estimates for purchases and resources that are required. It's funny because organizations differ. I worked with one company that literally I was talking to a chief technology officer, about a potential purchase of software, about $6,000. And while we're talking, he gets on the internet, literally purchases it, has it installed on his network. That's probably not the conditions that most of you deal with your IT departments. And so they vary. Some of them take literally an act of Congress to get anything approved. And so you need to plan for that and say what level of detailed gathering and documentation and project management and charter creation is necessary to really move projects forward in this. And so that's the thing. And also setting realistic timelines so that you're not starting off with a point of failure where you're missing key deadlines. You set the bar so high that you really are set up for failure and not success. And then coming up with this program or project plan allows you to be able to report back, have something measurable that you can report back to senior management, build in project milestones, and also help set expectations as you're moving forward. Okay, next slide. And so this is just one illustration. The following slides will see a few other ways that you can present a project plan and an overall program project plan with prioritized, separated out projects. And this gives you a view that shows, in this view, you also see some semblance of a timeline. It's not really laid out in a linear fashion. It's laid out in a more conceptual fashion, but it tells a story. It says, first, we need to establish our foundation for our RIM program, information governance program, whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. And then there are some follow-on things that build on that. Implementing this and fleshing it out throughout the organization then comes next. Improving on certain processes. There may be some tactical things that can speak to itches that need to be scratched or real needs that need to be addressed in your organization that can be quick wins. And then, other types of things. Are there cost savings? Are there other benefits? And so this sort of plan needs to be laid out in a way that it tells a compelling story and helps folks be able to identify and see, yes, this is something that our organization needs, and that helps you to build further. So I'll pass it back to Kathryn with the next slide, and she'll speak to some alternative ways to present your projects and view them.
So often executives like to see heat charts. It helps them grasp really easily what are the priorities with a set of manageable projects. And so this is an example of how we take that previous view and then start layering on additional information in terms of priority, effort, and resources. And so what we're trying to look at here is then which projects do we want to do first? Will they require heavy resource investments on our side? Will they be heavy in terms of cost resources as well? And then also looking at what other initiatives are currently underway. And so this is also an important part. For instance, if you have a project around data security and privacy, it's also worthwhile to go and talk with the security and privacy professionals in your organization to see if they already have a project in flight and make sure that we don't have competing initiatives that are really trying to result in the same goals or that can be merged into a single project. We've often found that once we start socializing this, there's a lot of cooperation that can come about and a lot more synergies in a lot of these different projects. Another example would be getting control of your electronic data. Often we'll find that there's initiatives underway to upgrade environments for moving to Office 365 or going to cloud-based solutions that we can leverage and build into part of our overall strategy. There might be initiatives underway for SharePoint. There might be point solutions for particular functional groups that we might be able to leverage. So again, as you're building it, putting the priorities together, it's important to understand what other initiatives are currently underway, where we can have, we can leverage those and find synergies to move forward. Next slide. So once we have the priorities in place, we really need to start looking at another view, which is that timeline view. We want to look at dependencies. We want to look at what key goals have been set. Again, this is where you start setting those deadlines, those realistic goals. we want to make sure that we understand, are there other MBOs that have executives have, and are we going to meet those MBOs that they might have? It's amazing how an executive MBO can drive a project. From a KPI standpoint, we also find that there might be performance improvement measurements that we can tie these initiatives to and can support those KPIs. Often we are working with audit findings, so we also want to make sure that if there was an audit finding and that there was a resolution date that needs to be reported back to the board, that can be a huge driver in getting projects done, but those deadlines also need to be taken into consideration. So again, it's looking at what your deadlines are, setting them realistically, and usually what we're doing is a 2 to 3 year time frame. Next slide. Steve, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, and so, this slide and the one following give you another view and show you how to tie the various elements we've been discussing as part of a project overall program plan together. And so this shows prioritized projects. This first slide we're seeing speaks of, in the first year, what are you trying to accomplish? And then the key, as we've spoken of before, is estimating the cost and the resources requirements. If in fact you're going to try to accomplish these things, then what sort of resources need to be in place in terms of cost? Are you going to use outside consultants, outside resources, outside vendors? Then those costs need to be estimated, and make sure you can secure those before setting a project plan up, where you have timelines and things that you're responsible and accountable for. Also, understanding soft dollar types of requirements in terms of time. If you're anticipating that you're going to have certain core team members who've been identified from certain departments that are going to be participating in weekly meetings or periodic reviews or sitting in on interviews, then obviously you need to have conversations with those folks and make sure it fits within their schedule and their timelines. So those are all things to look at. The key here with this also is to be realistic and not to underestimate. Sometimes there's a tendency to try to sugarcoat the truth a bit to make the actual cost seem palatable to gain senior management approval. What we say here is that we really caution clients that you really do want to count the costs if in some respects the Scotty principle comes into play. Scotty from Star Trek, where he basically under promises and over delivers. In counting, you want to be conservative with your estimates, and so something that you think may take 3 months, in reality, you want to build a buffer in. And so it's better to set those expectations up front and be able to show that you're performing better than the plan than to have to keep coming back to management and saying, well, okay, we have overruns. That's one thing that can stall out a project very quickly and kill it, because it demonstrates that, one, you haven't really thought this out, and then two, even if these are things outside of your control, seeing a plan that's constantly going off task, constantly having overruns, constantly then, not adequately sized in terms of estimating what the costs are up front, that is a recipe for disaster. And so it's better, again, to be realistic, to be very brutally honest as well in what you think the cost will be. Sometimes in doing this, you can get creative because you can find there may be resources internally that you can leverage. There may be other groups, other people who can participate. There may be systems. We find in doing assessments with company, often there's shelfware, ECM systems, licenses that no one knew existed, software and other resources that are available that you may not have counted on. And so that's something as well, is to see what can we do with the resources we have, and then externally, what do we really need to be able to move forward. Go to the next slide. And this again is just another view that shows, okay, for your second and third years out, this shows as well projects where you prioritize the early ones, the foundational types of projects up front. You may also want to have identified some quick tactical wins where you can recoup some cost savings, or you can fix a business process. It's very painful. You can improve customer service. And so you want to do those things up front to the extent possible. And then in your second, third year out, with some clients we do 3-5 year plans out. then you're saying, okay, what are the downstream things that we want to accomplish? So when you're building that all together and looking not just at the immediate future downstream, then you can help to be able to secure the resources and then plan overall, beyond just the immediate future.
Yeah, what happens often, Steve, is right, an executive will come back and we have a great first-year plan, but their first question is, what's this whole program really going to cost me? And so even though you may not have very specific estimates for downstream, if you have ranges even, that gives them a sense of magnitude for the projects, so that they know what they're getting into, and it's not just a policy and schedule, that there's really downstream implications and costs for the organization.
Right, absolutely. So, and that's a good transition into our next step in our next slide. There we go, which, as we've been hinting at all along, but you do want to be realistic in setting your goals and metrics. Baby steps first. Realize it's not realistic to think that your organization will be compliant out of the gate. And so setting those expectations up front and moving forward accordingly helps. Also, as you put your plan together, the key also is not to be so wed to the plan that you can't deviate from it. The idea with plans, as well as that you're laying something out, the purpose of a plan is to create movement in your organization. And so, perfect alignment and execution according to the plan isn't necessarily the goal, especially as you roll out a program, new facts may become available. Like we've mentioned, other resources might become available that you can leverage. Other priorities, other tactical projects that you might want to address come out. And so having the plan allows you then to make course corrections and changes because you actually have counted the costs up front and you have set some things in motion. It's easier to move when you're already in motion and to make a course correction than it is to start from basically a static position and get yourself moving. So again, the purpose of that step 2 is to get your plan moving. And here, 3, our advice is to be realistic in setting the metrics so that out of the gate you can meet with success and be prepared for it. Okay, next slide. So part of what's involved here is also right-sizing your approach. We've mentioned things, pitfalls like a copycat or cookie cutter, or trying to understand what's everyone else doing, and we do the same thing. If you take a plan that was built for another organization and try to apply it to your own, it often doesn't fit. It's like an ill-fitting set of clothes. And so the key to success in any organization is right-sizing it, making sure it's a cultural fit. And so we talk about out of the gate building those quick wins in, projects that address immediate cost savings at 6, identifying high-risk behavior, low resource efforts where you have the resources and you can address them, and then making sure it does fit the corporate culture. We mentioned earlier about the right pace. Some organizations are very deliberate and move slowly. This chart we see here on the right, some are very risk averse, and it's necessary because it's part of the business. If you're moving hazardous material, if you're dealing with nuclear waste, then you're going to be more highly regulated, and every action you take, because it can literally be associated with life and death, is necessarily going to be more deliberate. So organizations that are like that versus those that are more fast and loose, moving quickly, you'll have a different type of plan associated with that. So understanding your own culture and the tolerance for risk, what's the right pace. Look also to other projects and other initiatives that have met with success and study them and understand why did they gain executive support. Why are people behind them? What sort of itches are they scratching that maybe, the key with information management, governance, records management, is that really you have a hand into every business process in the organization that is dependent on information, which typically is everything in your business. So again, to the extent you can start to understand and articulate wins and benefits that are associated with the bottom line of your business, you'll be more successful. And so overall, you do want to align your program to your company's strategies and goals. Projects need to complement and enhance those corporate priorities, reconcile the policies. We find often with companies, they don't have even a policy on policies, or there's conflicts a lack of clarity between departmental, business, corporate policies. And so clearing those barriers of confusion out are important. And driving consensus, having those hard conversations, addressing the elephant in the room, and getting people together so you can move forward is key. Okay. Next slide, and I'll kick it back to Kathryn.
All right. So now that we've outlined kind of the priorities and the project steps, change management becomes an important part of the program. And as we've talked about in the structure of the program, change management also starts from a tops-down and bottoms-up approach. So we want to make sure that as we're developing the programs, we're communicating them with that executive or steering committee, that we have senior management involved and mid-level management so they are aware of the program and what are the wins for their particular organization. It is selling the change to them, and the best change management is showing them what the benefits are, and then communicating all of that down to the departments and to ultimately the employees. So it's that downward communication that needs to happen on a regular basis so that everybody's aware of the programs, what's going on, and the benefits for them. Next slide. And how you define that is by looking at what your current state is, again, going back to that assessment, what doesn't work now, and in communicating what is that desired end state. And the benefits are what lies in between for them, and that's the process. So putting together a good change management plan along the way will make sure that you end up at that desired state where that you have the appropriate use of information, you've got the reduced risk, and you've got all those drivers essentially mapped out for that future state. Next slide.
Okay, and this gets us into our last of the 5 major steps, audit and monitoring. And we have a big red stamp of audit. Often that's a dirty word for folks. It's seen as a negative. When you're being audited or you hear, the IRS is coming knocking on your door, usually not a good association with that. There's not a lot of touchy-feely feelings. And so, but the key with auditing, it's really the old adage that you need to inspect what you expect. And so really what we speak to our clients about is prepare yourself for success and expect it. And so it can be a positive. And a lot of this will depend on your culture as well. Is your culture something that only responds to punitive types of measures, the proverbial stick versus the carrot? And so you want to right size as well your audit and monitoring approach to your organization to make sure that's successful. Early on, you don't want to come down on folks who are trying to be compliant and are potential champions. You don't want to come down with a lot of wrist slapping. But you do want to set goals up front and say, what are we looking to do? And then come up with a documented plan and a phased approach that says, we're going to have a grace period to allow people to start coming online and complying. And ultimately then, what are ways we can also build in rewards? So it is not just the stick, it's the carrot. And so a key first step is evaluating where are you in the process, and then building in measurements from the beginning and planning for that. So you can see what goals have we set and are we reaching our goals. If you've built in the maturity model type of environment, you can also say where do we expect to be realistically and where are we? And then part of the key is being able to report and communicate. You want to, again, prepare for success, and then when you reach it, you want to celebrate that because that helps build momentum for your program and show that it's successful. The key also is not waiting until the projects are already underway. Put this into your plan so that, again, you are prepared for success and you can move forward. Okay, next slide. So some of the strategies around auditing or monitoring, again, are behavior change audits. Basically going back, if you've done a survey up front and gotten some benchmark and baseline, go back and re-survey people to see if their behaviors have changed. In some respects, that's having conversations, surveys, and others, if it's a technology-oriented solution, you can build that into the tools and actually see what people are doing. Look at classification, look at what people are doing with email. IT audits. If you have an email implementation and you're trying to get rid of PST files or individual archives, Are they no longer creating them? Are people underground archiving? What's the behavior? What's happening? Again, you have to inspect what's happening to set realistic goals for what you expect. If people don't see that you're not paying attention, or the organization's not, then they tend to not take it seriously. Typical gaps in are things like permanent records, saving documents on file shares, setting everything with the greatest retention period. So there are common behaviors and patterns that you can kind of anticipate and expect. Look for that, and then adjust your training and your communication accordingly. And then enforcement, some ideas around that is building that into actual employee performance objectives, building in these types of monitoring around search and reporting tools, looking for individuals who may be the outliers and basically, conveniently reminding them of their responsibilities and prioritizing the exception. I mean, basically, the more you pay attention to this, the more then you can sell this as a positive, and the more you can trumpet the benefits of, meeting the initiatives of the project, then the word will spread, and it's easier to get people in line. Okay? So I will kick that back, and we'll do the next slide, and I'll kick it back to Kathryn.
All right, so we wanted to show you some different types of project plans. When we break them up, really, when we see these and we're developing them for our clients, they fall into 4 different kind of buckets. We have very large, complex Fortune 500 clients that we work with, and we're developing very complex or detailed plans with a lot of different parts and pieces moving forward over those 3-year horizons. Smaller to medium enterprises are usually simpler approaches. They don't have the budgets and resources often that are available. Or we're doing very specific function or business unit plans because they have a particular solution that they're implementing, like claims or a healthcare system or something like that, or a financial planning kind of a system. So we're looking at different types of function or business unit specific implementations. We're also looking at technology implementations that are enterprise-wide then as well. Email, or we're looking at legacy remediation, backup tape remediation, how are we going to get a handle on unstructured data in SharePoint, those kinds of things. And so they tend to fall in these 4 areas. Next slide. So we're going to just quickly show you a couple examples then of how these large complex company plan might look. And again, your mileage may vary, but this is just to show you how often things are rolled out. So in a complex organization, we usually start with a foundation of a U.S. policy and schedule, and then we'll move to globalization. And so similarly, it's always usually starting with a baseline in the U.S. and then rolling out globalization incrementally. And how you do that might vary. It might be that you do it because we have one client right now where we've done the U.S., but we're moving to Australia, New Zealand, because that's an easier approach. They speak English. They've got headquarter locations in those particular countries. Another client we're working on, they want to go after China and Latin America first because they've got FCTA concerns that we can tie into. So again, it's looking at your organization, figuring out what the priorities and the right rollout strategy will work. Similarly, on looking at your complexity in terms of your IT infrastructure, what do you want to tackle first? Do you want to tackle email? Do you want to tackle unstructured data? Usually there's a prioritization there as you're rolling that out. And then typically paper records are less of a high priority. People have that often under control, but then there's some kind of remediation that comes downstream once you have that policy in place. So again, it's looking at the dependencies. We need to have the policy and schedule first before we can start in on some of the actual remediation projects. Next slide. And this is looking at a simpler implementation. So if you have a mid-sized company, they are often looking at smaller projects. They can often execute things in shorter time frames because we're rolling them out to 2,000 people instead of 20 to 30,000, 200,000 people. So often the core of the projects are the same, just the implementation and the number of steps can often be condensed. All right, Steve, I'll kick it to you to wrap it up here, and we can quickly go through some of the how to avoid getting stuck areas.
Okay, and back it up one slide. There we go. Okay, so how to avoid getting stuck. These are some of the usual problems we see, is that you're midstream and you lose a key stakeholder, or you have budget issues, or there's competing initiatives. And so there's strategies around each one of those. Again, the key is if you build a solid project plan and you build a foundation up front, the idea is you want to have cross-functional support so that the loss of any one player isn't significant. If you're aligned properly with your organization's goals, then it shouldn't, again, be tied to one individual. Same thing with budget. If you define a realistic set of projects and things up front, you'll be insulated against upturns and downturns within your organization more so. Competing initiatives, again, the key is to look if people are already passionate, motivated, moving in a direction, to what extent can you align with those versus seeing them as competing initiatives. Okay, next slide. And then sometimes you have issues around no one can make a decision. This is that elephant in the room. So defining the roles, ownership, responsibility up front is key. Sometimes the focus can be too much on a technology solution. That's an easy button type of thing. And so technology isn't the answer in and of itself. If you have a mess conceptually in terms of file plans and the way you organize information, if you just buy a product, it's somewhat of a blank slate. You can dump your mess in paper into an electronic environment, or from file shares into an ECM system. The key really is to set up the foundation first, the conceptual framework, define what you're doing, get consensus, and move on from there. So technology should be assisting the overall project plan, but your project plan shouldn't be dependent and oriented around it. And then delays, also, if you're doing that, then delays around technology purchases themselves become less significant because that's part of the plan supporting it, may delay it, but it shouldn't torpedo the entire thing. Okay, next slide. So lessons learned overall as we sum up. The key is you need to sponsor and evangelize. So you need to have the sponsorship and the support up front. And so develop that commitment. Again, really building the foundation is key. If you do that and do a good job of justifying, aligning it to your organization's priorities, involving the right leaders, champions, regularly communicate your activities and successes, then it makes the overall project, sets it up for success. So the key as well is collaboration, consensus. Have conversations with folks. And when you build your projects, make sure that the guidelines are clearly communicated. Speak of articulating clear accountability. Make sure that the key stakeholders buy in and accept. And then remain on schedule. If you say you're going to do things and set timelines, make them realistic, but then meet them. And so show that you're ahead of the game. Okay? Factor in all those external dependencies, but keep your roadmap and project plans up to date and keep everyone informed. Okay, next slide. I'll kick that back to Kathryn as we close.
As we close. So again, I think what you've heard today is break up those complex plans into manageable pieces so you don't let perfect be the enemy of good, that you keep those plans alive moving forward piece by piece. And what you want to do is set the goal of improving over time. You don't have to be 100% perfect to get the projects moving. All right, next slide, Bargoff, and we'll wrap up. So a little bit about Contoural. We want to have a Q&A as well. We are running about out of time, but if you would like to submit some questions, if we don't have time to answer them now, we will be happy to respond to anyone that has an urgent question via email. So I'll ask you to submit some questions now if you'd like us to respond. And while you do that, I'll just give you a little bit of background on Contoural. We are the largest independent provider of records and information management services. We do all sorts of different programs and projects around litigation readiness, records management, data privacy, as well as complex implementations of technology. However, we are independent. We do not sell any products or services. We don't host any data. But we really strive to sell services that have impact and measurable improvement for our clients. Next slide. This shows you just a little bit about our services in terms of the different areas that we provide our professional services. Next slide. And what we want to do is make sure that you understand we have other resources also available for you. If you would like to send this particular webinar link to other people you think might find it interesting, it will be posted up on our website under the webinar section. We also have a number of white papers out there, as well as different articles that we have had published. We also offer a 2-hour complimentary on-site seminar. So if you would like to have our executives come on site, talk about some of these issues, how you get these programs up and running, please let us know, and we will be happy to see if we can get something like that scheduled for you. All right, we are up at the top of the hour. Bhargav, one more slide, and then I think we'll open it up for one question, and then take everything else offline, and we will respond to you in email. Next slide. What we also wanted you to do today would be to please complete the webinar survey so that we know how we did. We really value your input and strive to make these better. So thank you for your time. And Steve, why don't you take, I see we have one question came in from Seattle. How can you get your execs really interested in the program?
Okay, good question. And you know, I think one key tip would be to look at anything your executives write. You know, if your company has gone to the trouble to put together a vision statement, values, mission statement, things of that nature, look at what your CEO, what your chairman, what your you know, president of your company says, and pay real close attention to their language, because a lot of times in that language they've given it a lot of thought, and so they're trying to set a strategic direction for the company. To the extent you can leverage that language, use it, apply it in a way that makes sense within your, you know, to your program, and can align it with the corporate or organizational priorities, you'll have a lot more success. It's just an adage. People like a lot of times to have parroted back to them what they say, and what they say is valuable. And so that's just a tip. One of the things we look to do in the organization is, you know, give me everything these people have written, what they say, speeches, things of that nature, and you know, start aligning from there.
All right. Well, that's our time for today. We thank you for joining, and we hope you'll come back and hear our upcoming webinars next month. Thank you.
Thank you much.